Tonight, we delve into the deepest, darkest secret of the Americas, the foundational nightmare upon which the great empires of the Maya and the Aztecs were reluctantly forced to build. Can you believe that beneath the jungle floor, hidden by centuries of oppressive, suffocating growth, lies the ghost of a civilization so powerful, so utterly terrifying that its memory was deliberately erased?
They were the architects of the impossible, the true mother culture. We are talking about the Olmec, the rubber people. Yet their legacy is far harder and colder than any tree sap. Their time frame? A staggering moment in the deep past. 1,000 years before Christ walked the earth. 1,000 years before Rome was anything more than a swampy village.
Imagine walking through the thickest, most humid rainforest imaginable, the kind of place where the air itself tries to choke you. And suddenly, the gloom breaks. Staring down at you, judging you, with cold, stony eyes, is a face carved from a single boulder weighing 40 tons.
This isn't just art. This is a declaration of absolute divine power, wrenched from the very earth and transported miles without the use of the wheel. Who were these giants? Where did they come from? And what unspeakable catastrophe led to their entire magnificent world simply vanishing into the mud?
For centuries, these massive, brooding stone heads, 15 of them found so far, have stood sentinel, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of everything that followed. They are the most compelling, enigmatic artifacts in the entire Western Hemisphere. They depict rulers, kings, perhaps even gods, wearing massive, heavy helmet-like headgear, their faces stern, serious, and utterly non-negotiable.
The sheer scale of the engineering required to create just one of these colossal monuments is enough to shatter modern logistical planning. We are talking about quarrying basalt miles away in the Tuxtla Mountains, dragging these 40-ton blocks through dense, unforgiving jungle, across treacherous rivers, and then sculpting them with astonishing precision tools in the humid, grueling heat of the coastal lowlands. This level of centralized power, this unbelievable coordination of thousands of laborers, suggests a government so tightly organized, so ruthlessly efficient, that it must have been utterly terrifying to live under. The Olmec weren't just farmers who discovered a cool rock. They were the first great engineers, the first true urban planners, and possibly the first group to realize that fear is the most effective building material. But the mystery deepens. Unlike the Egyptians who left endless records carved into every temple wall, or the Sumerians who documented every tax payment on clay tablets, the Olmec left almost nothing legible. We have their monumental achievements, their massive infrastructure, but their written history is a whisper, a tantalizing fragment suggesting they invented writing itself long before their sophisticated successors. Their very existence defies the standard narrative of human development in the Americas. Suddenly, around 1500 BCE,
in a region previously populated by small, scattered villages. Bam! An explosive cultural singularity erupts in the coastal Gulf of Mexico. It starts at a place called San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan, not to be confused with the later Aztec capital, but a site of equal, if not greater, foundational importance.
San Lorenzo wasn't just a village. It was a carefully constructed metropolitan center built upon a gigantic artificial platform that rose over 150 feet above the surrounding plains. Think of it, the first major city in Mesoamerica, a staggering feat of hydraulic engineering and massive earth-moving, controlling the surrounding waterways like a god controlling the floodgates.
This city was the epicenter of a trade network that stretched from the Mexican Valley down into Guatemala and beyond. They traded in jade, magnetite, obsidian, and high-status, terrifyingly powerful ritual objects. They didn't just exchange goods, they exchanged ideas, forcing their cosmological view onto every culture they encountered, and ensuring their dark influence spread like a contagion.
They were the ones who first perfected the use of the ritualistic ball game, that deadly, high-stakes spectacle where the losers often paid the ultimate, bloody price. They were the ones who first developed the iconic stepped pyramid shape, the blueprint for every subsequent great structure in the region, including the massive temples of Teotihuacan. They were the ones who saw the jaguar not just as a predator, but as a divine, shape-shifting entity capable of bridging the human and spirit worlds, a terrifying symbol of primordial chaos and kingly power.
But how does a culture leap so far ahead, so fast, without any visible local precursors? Did they receive outside influence that accelerated their development into the Bronze Age equivalent of a superpower? Was there some catastrophic environmental shift that forced radical, brutal centralization of power? The official archaeological answer is frustratingly simple. They just did. But the dramatic truth is far more complex and involves a terrifying manipulation of both nature and human labor that cost thousands of lives. We must confront the evidence of ritual mutilation, of intentional destruction, and the sudden, violent abandonment of their greatest centers. Did they collapse under the unbearable weight of their own ambition, their infrastructure failing under the stress of constant demands? Did the enslaved population finally revolt, drowning the elite in the muddy floodplains they once commanded? Or was the cataclysm something far stranger, perhaps related to the very gods they carved into the colossal, silent heads?
The Olmec story is the perfect tragedy. A meteoric rise based on technological superiority and ruthless control, followed by a mysterious, irreversible fall that left the inheritors scrambling to pick up the broken pieces of their world, terrified of the ghosts they left behind. Tonight, we unearth the forgotten founders. We examine the dramatic rise of San Lorenzo, the glorious and blood-soaked zenith of Venta, and the terrifying, enduring legacy of the men who wore those colossal stone helmets. We stand now on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, a hellish landscape of searing heat, mangrove swamps, and torrential rain. This was not the fertile cradle of civilization like the Nile or Mesopotamia. This was a watery, challenging grave, designed by nature to resist the permanence of man. And yet, in this impossible setting, around 1500 BCE, something utterly unprecedented happened, a cultural singularity that should not have occurred. It wasn't a gradual climb from simple village life to complex society. It was a detonation of genius, seemingly overnight. The Olmec didn't spend millennia learning how to master agriculture or engineering. They simply knew. Their history seems to skip the essential chapters dedicated to slow, painful evolution, presenting us instead with immediate, terrifying mastery. The first true capital, San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan, rose up like a defiant fist against the jungle. A sprawling urban center built entirely atop a massive artificial plateau, meticulously engineered to dominate the horizon and escape the inevitable flooding. This wasn't merely a settlement. It was a monument to human will, requiring millions of hours of grueling, back-breaking labor just to reshape the fundamental geology of the region. But the true stunning terror of their genius lay beneath the surface, hidden from prying eyes. Archaeologists uncovered intricate subterranean systems of drainage lines constructed from massive, hollowed-out U-shaped basalt stones, perfectly fitted together like sections of a giant concrete pipeline. This wasn't merely simple drainage. It was hydraulic engineering on a scale that no other civilization in the Americas would match for centuries, a testament to an organizational capacity that borders on the unbelievable. They controlled the land. They mastered the water, and they demanded obedience. And standing sentinel over this engineered metropolis were the silent, brooding giants, the colossal heads. In San Lorenzo alone, 10 of these monolithic portraits have been unearthed, each weighing between 10 and 20 tons, pure, solidified authority carved in stone. The material for these epic busts, volcanic basalt, did not originate from the local swamps. It was quarried deep within the distant Tuxtla Mountains, 60 to 100 kilometers away from the construction site. Stop and consider the sheer, terrifying logistics of this endeavor during the early formative period. These stones, larger than modern automobiles, had to be dragged, pulled, or floated across treacherous terrain, through dense jungle, and over swift, unforgiving rivers. This feat was accomplished using only human muscle, rough rope, log rollers, and the sheer, unrelenting force of a king demanding perpetual devotion. This was not transportation. This was the movement of mountains by men. Who were these men whose faces were carved into eternity, whose features stare blankly across 3,000 years. They were not yet the abstract, distant gods of later cultures, but rather hyper-realistic, chilling portraits of individual rulers, warrior kings who held life and death in their powerful hands.
The thick, protective helmets they wear are not benign ceremonial crowns. They are battle gear, suggesting a foundational society driven by conquest, resource control, and the constant threat of lethal inter-regional conflict. Even more disturbing is the pervasive evidence of intentional defacement and ritual destruction. Many of the heads were systematically mutilated, their noses broken, their ears chipped, and their massive surfaces marred by deep, violent gouges. This was not the random vandalism of subsequent invaders. This was the Olmec themselves, systematically destroying the likeness of a previous ruler, perhaps after a coup, a devastating military defeat, or simply the ritual completion of his tyrannical reign. They were actively erasing history, one gigantic, scarred stone face at a time. Then, as abruptly and mysteriously as it began, the era of San Lorenzo ended. Around 900 BCE, the sprawling capital was not gradually abandoned to decay, it was catastrophically dismantled and silenced. The colossal heads, those ultimate symbols of concentrated power, were violently toppled, buried face down, or rolled unceremoniously into nearby ravines. The sophisticated drainage systems were intentionally choked with debris and earth. The archaeological record is brutally silent on the cause, offering only the grim, undeniable evidence of sudden, total, and unexplained collapse. The great city was simply extinguished. But the story of the Olmec was not finished. The core power structure, the priests, the engineers, and the royal lineage simply relocated, migrating approximately 80 kilometers to the east, across the watery swampland, establishing the second, even more complex metropolis, Venta. Venta became the true, glorious zenith of Olmec power, a ceremonial city designed not just for mortal living, but for speaking directly to the cosmos itself. It was here that the Olmec truly perfected the architectural blueprint for all subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations, from Teotihuacan to the Maya. Its central structure, the massive conical mound known as Complex C1, was a towering, terraced structure, often cited as the oldest major pyramid in Mesoamerica. It was a terrestrial, man-made mountain, aligned precisely along a north-south axis, demonstrating an advanced, chilling understanding of celestial mechanics. The engineering was matched only by their fanatical obsession with precious, exotic materials, specifically jade and serpentine, minerals tougher than steel, acquired through vast, intimidating trade networks stretching hundreds of miles inland into the central valleys. They buried staggering caches of these precious stones,
Massive offerings lay deep beneath the plazas of La Venta. One incredible cache, known as the Massive Offering, contained 48 tons of polished serpentine blocks, arranged layer upon precise layer.
This was not mere hoarding. This was wealth and devotion on an unimaginable scale, burying unimaginable treasure simply to appease the hungry, unforgiving earth gods who demanded such ritualistic payment. It is here, at La Venta, that we find the terrifying, beating heart of their mythology. The Olmec were fascinated by duality, the blending of man and beast, of civilized life and savage nature. Their primary divine focus was the legendary were-jaguar, a creature of primal, ferocious power. This iconic figure, half-screaming infant, half-snarling jungle predator, represented the foundational rain god and fertility deity, a complex, terrifying composite that would morph and persist unchanged in the pantheons of the later Maya and the Aztec. They were the first people to formalize the Mesoamerican calendar system, that intricate, bewildering dance between the 260-day ritual calendar and the 365-day solar calendar. Time itself, as conceived by the Mesoamerican world, was their invention.
And perhaps, most frighteningly of all, they may have invented writing. The enigmatic Cascahal block, dating back to 900 BCE, displays 62 distinct signs, suggesting the very first stirrings of a sophisticated script. They wrote history, and then they made sure it was destroyed, leaving us only the terrifying, fragmented crumbs of their monumental legacy.
The obliteration of their written history, the purposeful scrubbing of the record, only amplified the terrifying majesty of the monuments they could not erase, the stone heads. These weren't mere portraits. They were declaration stamps of absolute, undeniable authority, carved into the very memory of the earth itself. These 14 colossal heads, scattered across their former heartland, San Lorenzo and La Venta, are the ultimate archaeological paradox. Each face, stern and specific, wears what looks like a thick, rigid helmet, suggesting not just kingship, but military dominance, a lineage of warrior priests whose power was beyond question. Imagine the scene, a raw, unforgiving jungle, humid air thick with the buzzing of insects, and suddenly, rising from the mist, a perfect, massive human face, sculpted from a single piece of volcanic rock that was never meant to be there. They are the stone ghosts of the rulers who watched their civilization rise, peak, and vanish. But the enigma isn't just the artistry, it is the physics. This wasn't limestone or sandstone. This was basalt, forged in the searing heart of a volcano, incredibly dense and resilient. The quarries lay in the Tuxtla Mountains, sometimes 50, sometimes 60 miles from the coastal plains where the heads were finally erected. We are talking about monoliths weighing up to 50 tons of pure, unyielding stone,
moved across swamps, rivers, and dense jungle, without the benefit of the wheel, without the use of draft animals. The logistics required to achieve this feat speak volumes about the terrifying organization of the Olmec state.
This was not democratic decision-making. This was the mandate of absolute power, the willingness to sacrifice thousands of lives and thousands of man-hours purely to immortalize one man's face. It demanded an almost industrial scale of human labor management, overseen by a terrifyingly efficient elite.
They didn't just walk the stones, they engineered the route. Scholars postulate a combination of human muscle, leveraging massive wooden rollers and sledges, paired with the brilliant strategic exploitation of the region's hydraulic systems. They mastered the waterways. During the rainy season, when the rivers swelled and the floodplains became navigable, the Olmecs would likely load these titanic blocks onto gigantic, reinforced rafts, guiding them down the currents of the Coatzacoalcos river system.
This wasn't just transportation. It was a grand ceremonial demonstration of control over the natural world, a propaganda parade proving that their rulers could command the earth, the water, and the very bodies of their subjects. They were the first true hydraulic despots of the continent. The engineering prowess wasn't limited to moving heavy objects. As the center of gravity shifted from San Lorenzo to the majestic site of La Venta, the true apex of Olmec civilization, their architectural ambition scaled up dramatically. La Venta was not built organically. It was a meticulously planned ceremonial city, laid out along a rigid north-south axis, demonstrating an advanced understanding of orientation and cosmology that would influence every future Mesoamerican city, from Teotihuacan to Chichen Itza.
At its heart stood Complex C, the Great Pyramid. It might not look like the sharp-angled pyramids of the later Mayans, but it is epical. Built of rammed earth, standing over 100 feet tall, its unique fluted ridged shape has led many to believe it was meant to represent a mountain, or perhaps a massive man-made volcano.
This structure, the oldest large pyramid in Mesoamerica, was the literal and spiritual mountain upon which their culture rested. It wasn't a tomb, but a stage, a connection point between the terrestrial realm and the celestial plane, a place where the rulers could perform their necessary rituals.
But perhaps the most chilling evidence of the Olmec elite's absolute control lay not in the sky-reaching structures, but deep beneath the earth. At La Venta, archaeologists uncovered stupendous caches of buried offerings, not for recovery, but for permanent, sacred deposition. We are talking about massive pavement mosaics, crafted from 500 tons of brilliantly colored serpentine blocks, depicting stylized jaguar faces, or perhaps abstract celestial symbols. These weren't visible. They were immediately covered and buried. Think of the staggering waste of resources, the hundreds of miles these raw materials were traded from: jade from Guatemala,
magnetophyte from distant highlands, serpentine from Oaxaca, only to be laid out as a colossal, secret sacrifice to the earth god, visible only to the divine. This was the ultimate expression of power, the ability to command immense wealth, resources, and labor, and then simply bury it, sacrificing the visible to secure the invisible favor of the cosmos. The elites of the Olmecs operated on a scale of profound spiritual terror. Their trade networks, required to fuel this extravagance, were the arteries of the mother culture, stretching from the Valley of Mexico south to Central America. They were not just trading goods, they were trading the foundations of culture, religious iconography, political structures, and the very language of rulership. The iconic features, the downturned, snarling mouth of the jaguar, the cleft head representing the corn sprouting from the skull, the obsession with jade as the ultimate symbol of life and renewal, all originate here, radiating outwards like a shockwave of cultural influence. The very gods that the Maya and the Aztecs would later worship, the rain god, the corn god, the feathered serpent, all have their earliest, most frightening prototypes in the Olmec pantheon. They were the theological architects of the continent, laying down spiritual law that would last for millennia. Their influence became so pervasive, so fundamental, that when the Olmec heartland sites, like Venta, finally succumbed to the same mysterious, sudden abandonment that swallowed San Lorenzo, the cultural seeds they had sown were already firmly rooted across the Mesoamerican landscape. It wasn't a true death. It was a transmutation. Their centralized political power evaporated, but their cultural DNA remained intact, waiting for the Mayans in the south and the emerging Teotihuacanos in the north to pick up the tools and the theology left behind. But the question remains, even as their influence spread, what darkness swallowed the colossal heads themselves? What terrifying internal or external force was powerful enough to silence the mother culture? The answer may lie in their most sacred, most guarded invention, the calendar of destiny. We stand now at the threshold of their intellectual singularity, staring down the very technology that allowed the Olmecs to foresee the future, perhaps even their own sudden, catastrophic demise. They didn't just count days, they charted the cycles of creation and destruction, encoding this terrifying, arcane knowledge into basalt monuments that stretch far beyond the limits of recorded human memory. The calendar of destiny was not merely a time-keeping device. It was the ultimate tool of absolute power, allowing the Olmec astronomer priests to stand atop the world and dictate the very rhythm of existence to the terrified masses. Their genius was rooted in a concept so profound, so devastatingly simple, that it would not be fully grasped by European minds for another 2 millennia: the invention of absolute zero. The Greeks were still stumbling through basic arithmetic,
limited by systems that couldn't comprehend nothing. But here, deep in the steaming jungles of the Gulf Coast, the Olmec elite had mastered the void. They invented the concept of zero, not as a mere placeholder, but as a philosophical anchor for their entire universe, the perfect center point from which all cosmic calculations could spring.
A simple shell shape or a stylized dot combined with the bar system for 5. That was the power equation that unlocked the cosmos for the mother culture. This wasn't merely math class. This was divine revelation made tangible, allowing them to calculate not just days and months, but epochs spanning tens of thousands of years through their sophisticated base 20 vigesimal structure.
Think about that chilling intellectual leap. While other emerging civilizations were preoccupied with the next annual harvest, the Olmecs were planning for the next great cosmic renewal, building monuments not for their immediate descendants, but for a humanity centuries yet unborn, positioning themselves as the only necessary bridge between cycles.
Their true masterpiece, the clockwork mechanism of their destiny, was the long count calendar. It was a linear, terrifyingly precise tracking system that didn't just measure the year, it measured the current great cycle of the world, mapping the path from one creation to the next. Every date they carved, every stela they erected, was a coordinate on this inescapable map of time, starting from a mythical point of creation, usually fixed around 3114 BCE. This calendar wasn't just a record, it was a prophecy engine used to legitimize their ruthless rule. The Olmec elite, the handful of privileged priests, claimed they held the keys to the future, controlling when the sun would rise, when the rains would fall, and when the inevitable cosmic reset would occur. Imagine the profound terror, the absolute unquestionable authority derived from knowing the exact day the world was scheduled to end, or perhaps to begin again, under their command. And how did they record these dizzying sacred calculations? Through the earliest definitive writing system in all of the Americas. Before the Zapotecs, before the magnificent rise of the Mayans, there was the Olmec script, perhaps best exemplified by the mysterious artifact known as the Cascajal block. This serpentine slab, covered in 62 distinct repeating glyphs, stands as solid, irrefutable evidence that the Olmecs were not just brilliant engineers and massive sculptors. They were the archivists of deep time, the first true historians of the hemisphere. But this writing, unlike the simple notations found elsewhere, was not meant for the masses. It was a sacred cipher, a tool of intellectual and social control. The symbols weren't just letters, they were cosmological statements, accessible only to the priest kings who lived inside the towering ceremonial centers like Venta and San Lorenzo. They held the knowledge, and knowledge, in the humid, demanding heart of the Olmec world, was the ultimate currency of survival, carefully guarded and ruthlessly deployed to ensure compliance.
This level of mathematical and astronomical precision wasn't just used for observing the distant, indifferent stars. It was used to violently rule the earth beneath their feet. To maintain control over their enormous, resource-intensive settlements, the Olmecs needed to master the most volatile element of their jungle home, water itself. They became the unquestioned masters of hydraulic engineering. Look at the remnants discovered beneath the soil at San Lorenzo. Complex, intricate systems of basalt drain pipes, designed not just to move sewage or divert simple rainwater, but perhaps to control the ceremonial flow of sacred water for ritual purification, or even early, highly controlled irrigation schemes. These aren't crude ditches haphazardly dug into the mud. These are meticulously planned, underground networks built from tons of precisely carved volcanic rock, demonstrating an astonishing grasp of physics and logistics. The very same engineering genius that allowed them to calculate the precise movement of the planet Venus over generations allowed them to regulate the unpredictable seasonal floods of the Gulf Coast, ensuring the incredibly fertile lands yielded their bounty with supernatural regularity, cementing the belief that their rulers were truly divine controllers of nature and time. They had solved the puzzle of the cosmos, harnessed the power of zero, and engineered their own climate. They were untouchable, omniscient, and utterly dominant. But here is the paradox that keeps historians awake at night, shivering under the weight of the unknown. If they could master time, if they could harness the void of zero, if they could engineer the perfect, self-sustaining city, why did the perfection end? Why did they deliberately bury the great stone heads, shattering their own symbols of power and collapsing their entire foundational system of belief? Was the calendar of destiny not just an observer of time, but an architect of their fate? Did their own prophecies, their own terrifying calculations reveal a future so bleak, so inevitable, so completely unchangeable, that the Olmecs chose immediate, violent self-erasure over confronting the ultimate cosmic deadline?
The silent, staring, impossibly heavy eyes of the colossal heads hold the final, dreadful secret. And that secret involves the terrifying, blood-soaked demands of the primordial were-jaguar god, who had clearly decided that the mother culture's time was finally, irrevocably up.
The price of being the mother culture was an unending toll, a demand for perfection that transcended human capability, paid in blood and sweat and the agonizing quarrying of impossible stone. The Olmecs were not just builders. They were slaves to a monumental theological engine that ran on pure, terrifying belief, convinced that if they stopped, the very world would rip itself apart and swallow the fertile jungle whole. The secret of their longevity was not engineering. It was absolute, terrifying spiritual obedience, enforced by the most powerful shaman kings Mesoamerica would ever know. These rulers,
Those figures whose stylized, downturned mouths we see echoed across every piece of Olmec artistry were not mere governors. They were living conduits, the only bridge between the unforgiving jungle earth and the silent, judging sky. They operated under the absolute, undisputed conviction that they alone understood the cycles of the rain, the fury of the storm, and the hunger of the divine feline deity that walked among them in the misty shadows. Their authority was based on their documented ritual ability to transform, to shed their human skin and meet the were-jaguar on its own terrifying ground, ensuring the rains would fall and the corn would grow.
But this divine mandate came at an infrastructural cost so staggering, it remains one of the true unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. Imagine the sheer, impossible logistical nightmare, the brutal, bone-breaking labor required to satisfy this divine obsession with geometry and stone. We are talking about the Tuxtla mountain range, a volcanic, rugged source of the dense, flawless basalt needed for those magnificent, haunting, colossal heads, a distance of 80 kilometers, or 50 miles, from their ceremonial heartland in Venta.
Every single one of those 50-ton stone portraits was dragged, levered, and pulled through dense, unforgiving swamp and across raging rivers, a grueling journey that spanned weeks, demanding the lives of hundreds of laborers simply to reach the water's edge. This civilization, the absolute foundation of all future Mesoamerican engineering marvels, faced one crucial handicap. They didn't have the wheel, a concept that would have revolutionized their transportation, nor did they possess iron or bronze tools capable of cleanly cutting such stubborn, igneous rock.
Instead, they relied on sheer, overwhelming human force, chipping the stone with harder obsidian and quartz, then loading the colossal boulders onto gigantic, precarious river rafts, carefully constructed from massive, lashed-together logs. The journey down the Coatzacoalcos River must have been an absolute heart-stopping nightmare, battling strong currents and the constant, terrifying threat of capsizing, knowing that if the king's sacred likeness slipped beneath the water, the gods themselves would hold them personally responsible for the ensuing cosmic catastrophe. Failure was simply not an option when the stability of the entire cosmos rested on your ability to deliver a 50-ton rock to its exact predetermined spot. This wasn't just construction. It was a sacred alignment of the Earth's energies. And when the Olmecs shifted their center of power from San Lorenzo to the new, spectacular site of Venta around 900 BCE, they cemented this terrifying relationship between religion and urban design. Venta, built entirely on an island ridge in the middle of a swampy delta, was laid out with an exacting precision that still baffles modern archaeologists who study its terrifyingly perfect symmetry. The entire ceremonial complex was ruthlessly oriented 8 degrees west of true north, possibly aligning with significant celestial events or the rising points of certain rain deities in their heavily structured cosmos. At the site's center rose the immense fluted clay pyramid, Complex C, a monumental structure built not of stone, but of over 100,000 cubic meters of carefully compacted earth, designed specifically to mimic the volcanic mountains they held sacred as the birthplaces of gods and water. But the true terror, the real proof of their desperate theological commitment, lies buried deep beneath the earth in the plaza area. The massive offerings. These were not casual deposits left on a temple floor. They were incredible, deliberate acts of planetary appeasement, requiring incomprehensible labor just to prepare the sacrificial pit before the offerings were even placed. The Olmecs dug massive 5-meter deep pits the size of modern swimming pools, then lined the bases with flawless serpentine pavement blocks imported from distant mountains, thousands of tons of heavy green stone. They then meticulously filled the whole structure back up with carefully selected, imported colored clay, layer upon excruciating layer, creating a sealed vault of sacrifice. Massive offering 2 alone required an estimated 1,000 metric tons of serpentine blocks, stones that had to be transported and meticulously arranged, only to be immediately buried and never seen again. A gesture of pure, unadulterated, desperate devotion to the underworld deities and the insatiable were-jaguar. This wasn't about displaying wealth or demonstrating power to rival city-states. It was about hiding it, burying it deep within the Earth Mother's womb as a catastrophic ransom payment, a desperate plea for the continuation of the planting cycle and the protection from the ravages of the storm god. The fact that they would expend such monumental resources, the manpower, the engineering, the transportation, only to instantly seal it away, speaks volumes about the depth of their spiritual terror and the absolute, unquestioning authority of their ruling class. Their greatest achievements, the colossal heads, the aligned plazas, the buried serpentine treasures, were simultaneously their most desperate acts of survival, a constant, exhausting struggle against a perceived cosmic bet that could never truly be repaid. The mother culture was living on borrowed time, perpetually pouring their very lifeblood into the jungle floor, hoping the gods wouldn't notice the growing cracks in the magnificent, terrifying foundation they had built entirely upon fear and the impossible movement of stone. This relentless pressure, this constant drain on their resources, would ultimately prove fatal, leaving the door wide open for the cataclysm that was already brewing in the shadows of the Gulf Coast jungle. The cataclysm was brewing, yes, but the Olmec elite were not blind to the tremors beneath their feet. They saw the strain, the exhaustion of the population, the sheer impossibility of sustaining the San Lorenzo complex under relentless environmental attack, and decided not to scale back, but to magnify their power in a desperate, final, monumental gamble. If the common people were faltering in their faith, the rulers would simply build gods so big that they could not be ignored. This decision initiated the dramatic, civilization-defining shift toward the east,
abandoning the venerable but increasingly unstable grounds of San Lorenzo and migrating the entire operational heart to the swampy isolation of Venta.
This was not a retreat. It was an ideological reboot, a massive declaration carved into the very landscape of the Gulf Coast. Venta was not merely a new capital. It was a theocratic monument designed to cement the Olmec's divine right to rule through sheer, terrifying engineering power.
Imagine the logistical nightmare of transplanting an entire culture's administration and sacred objects across dozens of miles of dense, unforgiving jungle, all while facing the internal descent that their previous failures had sown.
Yet they succeeded, raising Venta on a natural island ridge, transforming it from a mere patch of earth into the single most important ceremonial center of the ancient Olmec world, dating back to 900 BC.
The design itself was a spiritual blueprint, meticulously planned and executed with astronomical precision. The entire complex was intentionally oriented 8 degrees west of north, an alignment that speaks to a profound cosmological understanding, perhaps tracking the setting of a crucial star or the path of the sun during a sacred cycle. This level of planning confirms that the Olmec were not just powerful builders. They were master astronomers and geometricians whose knowledge base underpinned every subsequent Mesoamerican calendar system.
They leveled the earth, constructed immense retaining walls, and then, dominating the entire site, they erected the massive earthen pyramid known as Complex C. This wasn't built of stone. It was a conical mountain sculpted from millions of basketloads of clay, rising nearly 100 feet into the humid sky. This colossal mound, shaped like a volcano, or perhaps a stylized fluted cone, was the ultimate axis mundi, the physical connection point between the Olmec rulers and the divine realm, a constant, silent testament to the ruler's absolute authority over the very earth. But the true secrets of Venta lay not in the structures that scraped the sky, but in the astounding, almost incomprehensible treasures buried beneath the plazas. The Olmec elite performed acts of architectural and spiritual sacrifice that defy modern logic. Beneath the Great North Court, archaeologists uncovered massive offering 4, a pavement spanning nearly 60 feet, meticulously constructed from 485 tons of serpentine blocks imported from hundreds of miles away. This incredible effort, the quarrying, the transportation, the painstaking assembly of this geometric mosaic was performed only for it to be immediately covered over and permanently buried. Why? It was the ultimate ritual payment, a desperate, spectacular offering of priceless wealth and unimaginable human labor to appease the earth gods, a plea for stability in a world rapidly descending into chaos.
The very act of burying these millions of dollars worth of imported jade and serpentine speaks volumes about the Olmec leaders' growing desperation. They were gambling the entire economy on spiritual appeasement.
And surrounding these sacrificial centers, watching over this terrifying display of faith and fear, were the silent, brooding faces of power, the colossal heads of Venta. Though fewer in number than those at San Lorenzo, these 9 heads found at Venta were positioned strategically, guarding the sacred precincts, their massive forms reinforcing the myth that the Olmec ruler was quite literally a demigod walking among them. These are not idealized images. Look closely at the helmeted features, the thick lips, the stern, hyper-realistic gaze. These are individualized portraits, the faces of the great caudillos, the absolute monarchs who held the life and death of the Olmec people in their hands. The engineering feat required to move these 40-ton basalt monoliths from the Tuxtla Mountains 50 miles away across the swampy, roadless jungle is still a source of professional awe and historical dread. There were no wheels, no metal tools, no beasts of burden, only human muscle, ropes, wooden rollers, and the sheer, unyielding will of the Olmec elite, who were determined to make the stone serve their ambition. This transportation process was not just construction, it was a psychological operation designed to crush any thought of resistance by forcing thousands of laborers into back-breaking servitude for years, solely to move a single magnificent boulder. The stones were weapons of state control, ensuring that every ounce of surplus energy was consumed by the demands of the rulers, leaving nothing for rebellion. But the tragedy of the colossal heads did not end with their installation. Like those at San Lorenzo before them, the heads of Venta tell a chilling story of final, violent rejection. When they were discovered, many had been deliberately defaced, mutilated, or ritually destroyed. The eyes, the nose, the lips, the features that defined the divine identity of the ruler, were smashed with extreme prejudice. This was not random vandalism. This was political iconoclasm, a profound, targeted act of overthrow. Was this destruction inflicted by an outside invading force intent on erasing the memory of the Olmec? Or, perhaps more horrifically, was it the final, desperate eruption of the Olmec people themselves, finally breaking free from the economic and spiritual tyranny that the heads represented? The evidence suggests the latter. Some of the damaged heads were not discarded. They were meticulously recarved into altars or thrones by the people who followed. This suggests that the new regime, born from the collapse, still revered the stone, the sacred material itself, but utterly rejected the face, the identity of the God-King who had driven them to the brink. The Olmec mother culture was not swept away by an enemy. It imploded under the weight of its own impossible demands.
La Venta, the ultimate display of power, would soon follow the path of San Lorenzo, slipping into the great, terrifying silence. The silence that descended upon La Venta was not merely the absence of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of oblivion, wrapping around the colossal earthen pyramid that had once dared to pierce the heavens. The calendar cycles, the meticulous rituals, the roar of 10,000 subjects, all faded, replaced by the relentless sigh of the jungle reclaiming its own, whispering secrets to the crumbling stone. This was not a slow, gentle decay. This was a deliberate, terrifying termination of 1,000 years of absolute rule, a final, catastrophic shuttering of the ultimate power center in Mesoamerica. But before the last priests and nobles abandoned the sacred precinct, they performed acts so shocking, so utterly final, they speak volumes about the nature of their collapse. They didn't just walk away and let the jungle devour their legacy. They meticulously destroyed or entombed their entire history, hiding it away like a secret too terrible to be seen by the light of day. Imagine the desperate, frantic effort as they dragged those impossible basalt monuments, the very faces of their divine rulers, and sealed them beneath layers of clean, colored clay and rubble. They were performing an irreversible ceremony of cultural suicide, sealing their greatest achievements away from future enemies, or perhaps simply protecting them from the spiritual contamination of a world that was clearly ending. They buried the colossal heads, not as a mark of shame, but perhaps as a mark of ownership, whispering a dark promise that one day their divine rulers might rise again from the earth. Around 400 BCE, the physical heart of the Olmec world suffered terminal systemic failure. Where did the millions go? This is the fundamental, terrifying question of the Olmec disappearance, a void in history that defies easy explanation. It wasn't a migration driven by famine alone, nor was it the decisive blow of a single invading army. The entire infrastructural and spiritual complex, the interwoven network of trade, political influence, and religious awe that stretched across the Gulf Coast, simply ceased to function. Did they melt back into the jungle, forgetting the weight of imperial civilization? Or did they carry the seeds of their mother culture to distant, unsuspecting lands, planting the foundations for the empires yet to come? The latter, we know, is the truth that haunted the succeeding millennia. The mother culture was dying, but she was pregnant with her successors, dispersing her intellectual and artistic DNA like spores carried on the wind. Look closely at the emerging power centers far to the south and west during this critical transition period, and you see the unmistakable echoes of Olmec genius manifesting suddenly and spectacularly. In the highlands of Oaxaca, the Zapotec are developing sophisticated urban planning and monumental architecture at Monte Alban, seemingly drawing blueprints from an invisible, forgotten hand. And down on the Pacific coastal plain of Chiapas and Guatemala, the enigmatic site of Izapa begins to bloom, displaying monumental stelae and cosmological concepts that mirror the very symbolism we saw etched onto the smallest Olmec jade axes. The jaguar god, the feathered serpent,
the concept of sacred kingship. These pillars of Mesoamerican belief were not invented by the Maya or the Zapotec. They were inherited, often fully formed, from the vanishing masters of the great swamps.
In the western reaches of the former Olmec territory, one final center attempted to keep the dying flame alive, Tres Zapotes. It lacked the terrifying centralized scale of San Lorenzo and the ritual precision of La Venta, but it housed the final, profound intellectual achievements of this dynasty. Here, the priests were not just carving faces of kings, they were mapping the very fabric of time itself, attempting to secure immortality through mathematics and astronomy. The discovery of Stella C at Tres Zapotes is arguably the single most important artifact linking the Olmec directly to the entire future of Mesoamerican thought. While damaged, this monument contained glyphs suggesting an early, functional form of the long count calendar. This sophisticated system, later perfected by the Maya, charted time not in simple solar years, but in vast astronomical cycles stretching back millions of years into the mythical past.
It was an intellectual legacy of staggering, defiant complexity, a desperate final gift left by a civilization that knew its own physical presence was about to be extinguished. Imagine the pressure, the chilling urgency of those final generations of scribes, knowing the great cities were crumbling, yet dedicated to recording the movement of the cosmos itself for an unknown posterity. They understood that stone heads could be buried, but the knowledge of the universe, once written, could never truly die.
Tres Zapotes became the Epi-Olmec period, a final, fading echo of the glorious age, stretching its influence until roughly 300 BCE. The terrifying, massive portraits of dynastic rulers ceased completely. The age of the 20-ton basalt face was over, replaced by a shift from brute power projection to the quieter, more enduring power of the written word, visible in their emerging Epi-Olmec script. But even Tres Zapotes could not escape the gravitational pull of the heartland's terminal collapse.
The resources dried up, the vital trade routes fragmented, and the spiritual authority, once absolute, became diluted into regional cults that no longer answered to the great cities. By 300 BCE, the Great Delta region, the sacred space where the Olmec had pioneered kingship, cosmology, and colossal art, was utterly engulfed in darkness and relentless vegetation. The silence was complete and terrifying. The mother culture had vanished, leaving only ghosts, buried stones, and an instruction manual for empire building, hidden within the cultural DNA of every succeeding civilization. The stage was now set for the rise of the true intellectual heirs, the Zapotec, and the mighty, star-obsessed Maya. But the Olmec horror story, the cautionary tale of unsustainable power, was only just beginning to unfold its lessons for the ages to come.
The great centers of Venta and San Lorenzo had become tombs of silence, swallowed by the insatiable green jungle that always wins the final battle in Mesoamerica. The wind whispered through the ruins of the earthen pyramids, monuments built not of lasting stone, but of pure, crushing will, signaling the end of an era so magnificent it was almost mythological. The heirs, the people of the Valley of Oaxaca and the rising genius of the Yucatan, looked upon these ghosts and knew they were standing on the foundations of a forgotten catastrophe. A lesson etched in the jungle's heart. A chilling testament to power that burns too bright.
But the complete physical disappearance of the Olmec rulers only amplified their spiritual influence, turning them from kings into cultural ghosts, whose shadows stretched across every subsequent empire. What truly survived the cultural annihilation was the terror, the primal fear encoded in the Olmec cosmology, the cult of the were-jaguar, the fusion of man and beast that defined divine rule. This wasn't merely a decorative motif. It was the blueprint for divine kingship across the entire region for thousands of years to come. A mandate of brutal, transformative power that demanded both absolute loyalty and profound sacrifice. Imagine the most powerful being on Earth, the apex predator of the Mesoamerican forest, merged with the chilling intellect of a human ruler. A king who could literally transform into the night hunter under the ecstatic influence of potent ritual and restricted knowledge. These rulers were not just political leaders, they were living portals, shamans of unparalleled power who walked the razor's edge between the mundane world and the terrifying spirit realm known only as the Otherworld, the domain of the ancestors and the dark gods.
The grotesque, snarling visages carved in jade celts and monumental stone altars are not portraits of peaceful deities, but portraits of kings in the moment of divine transformation, their lips pulled back in a frightening snarl, their eyes almond-shaped and vacant, ready to devour the light and wield the jungle's unbridled savagery. This powerful imagery, the infant with the cleft head merging with the jaguar's raw musculature, spoke of an inherited curse and an unimaginable privilege, a legacy of blood and transformation that terrified the Maya centuries later.
And this is why the Olmec engineering was so terrifyingly precise and focused. Every mound, every perfectly aligned axis at Venta was designed to reinforce this connection, to turn the physical earth into a mirror of the cosmos, and stabilize the very fabric of reality under the king's watchful eye. The central pyramid at Venta, a massive fluted cone shaped like a volcano, wasn't just a building. It was the ultimate axis mundi, the central pole connecting the subterranean underworld, the human realm, and the celestial heavens in one unbroken line of sacred energy. The ceremonial centers were designed to channel the spiritual chaos of the world into manageable ritual acts, establishing the patterns of worship and astronomical observation that would define Mesoamerica for millennia. They oriented their cities not randomly, but along precise astronomical alignments, showing an early, profound understanding of celestial mechanics, tied directly to their divine right to rule and their ability to predict the turning of the seasons. But perhaps the most unnerving aspect of their legacy lies beneath the earth itself, in the intentional, massive offerings they buried and then immediately abandoned, sealing away their wealth as if performing an emergency cosmic reset. They didn't bury treasure for future retrieval. They buried power to stabilize the cosmos, executing a spiritual transaction with the most frightening efficiency imaginable. Think of the enormous, intricately carved serpentine mosaics buried 25 feet deep beneath the plaza floors at Venta. Hundreds of tons of imported jadeite and serpentine, material hauled hundreds of miles through the dense, unforgiving jungle, meticulously arranged into stylized masks or colossal jaguar faces, and then, without ceremony or explanation, immediately covered over with dense clay and layers of colorful dirt, sealed forever from human sight. This was a sacrifice on a scale that defies modern comprehension, a demonstration of cosmic obligation, where wealth was only valuable if it was permanently removed from human hands and offered back to the hungry earth itself. They possessed the spiritual authority not just to amass power, but to destroy wealth for the sake of the world's cosmological balance, an extravagance that speaks volumes about their perceived place in the universe. Who else in antiquity dared to be so utterly wasteful in the name of ritual purity and cosmic necessity? This same terrifying sense of cosmic obligation fueled their rituals of life and death, rituals that involved human blood and the precursors to the infamous Mesoamerican ball game, the deadliest sport history has ever recorded. While the exact rules and frequency of the Olmec version remain murky, the rubber balls they utilized, some of the earliest known examples in the world, crafted from local latex, prove they established the brutal high-stakes contest that the Maya and Aztec would later perfect into a spectacle of fatal consequence and political theater. The game was more than sport. It was ritualized warfare, a desperate attempt to replay the creation myth and ensure the sun's movement by shedding the blood of the players. The blood, the speed, the desperate scramble for the victory that sometimes ended in the ritual beheading or disembowelment of the losing captain. It all began with the mother culture, driven by that same need to feed the hungry gods and ensure the sun's daily rebirth against the forces of darkness. When the later civilizations looked back, they didn't see mere ancestors. They saw titans, rulers so powerful they could move mountains, sacrifice entire fortunes, and demand the blood of their subjects, and then vanish without a trace, leaving only colossal heads to guard the ruins. The shadow of the were-jaguar stretched across every jungle temple and every painted codex of the subsequent 2,000 years, a permanent warning and a chilling command: build bigger, bleed deeper, or share the terrifying fate of the first great civilization of Mesoamerica. Their silence is the loudest, most persistent echo in history, a testament to a power too great to last. The true terror of the Olmec wasn't just found in the faces of their stone giants, but in the very ground they walked upon, in the earth they had painstakingly, agonizingly subjugated. They didn't just build cities, they engineered the hostile, swampy landscape of the Gulf Coast to obey their every whim, turning a logistical nightmare of river deltas and marshes into the heartland of the mother culture. This was not survival, this was dominance achieved through hydraulic genius, a sophisticated mastery over water management that secured the agricultural surplus required to feed an entire hierarchy of priests, artisans, and the ruthless ruling elite for well over 1,000 years.
Venta, the ultimate Olmec power center, stands as a chilling testament to this obsessive control and the sheer audacity of their architecture. They did not just occupy an island, they fundamentally reshaped it, using astronomical alignment and an unholy amount of coordinated labor to turn a marshy hummock into a cosmic map etched onto the landscape. The centerpiece, the Great Pyramid, structure C1, was not built from quarried rock, but from millions of cubic feet of packed earth, meticulously molded into a cone, a man-made mountain rising dramatically from the flatness of the surrounding delta.
But the truly terrifying secrets of Venta lay beneath the visible monuments, hidden from the sun in massive, deliberately buried offerings that beggar modern comprehension. Imagine pits dug 25 feet deep into the clay, then meticulously filled not with trash, but with unparalleled wealth. Thousands of tons of serpentine blocks, polished jadeite axes, and highly complex mosaic pavements depicting the fearsome spiritual ancestor, the Olmec jaguar god. This wealth was not displayed, it was interred immediately, a deliberate, colossal burial of resources never intended to be seen again by human eyes.
Think about the logistics of this spiritual transaction. These serpentine and jade stones were quarried hundreds of miles away, transported down treacherous rivers, and then, upon reaching the sacred center, they were consecrated and immediately entombed. Why would an empire commit such an unbelievable act of economic suicide, the equivalent of burying all the gold in the king's treasury, only for the earth itself? This transcends mere ritual. It suggests a deep-seated, desperate cosmic contract, a terrifying, ongoing effort to anchor their temporal power into the eternal, volatile forces of the underworld.
The Olmec elite were obsessed with geological permanence, possibly fearing that if they stopped giving back to the earth in this colossal, tangible manner, the very land they depended upon would reclaim them entirely, pulling their civilization back into the primordial ooze. While the colossal heads served as portraits of specific, terrifying rulers, the stelae and massive stone thrones told the epic operational history of the Olmec state, detailing the precise rules of their divine right.
These monolithic slabs were the historical documents of the mother culture, detailing the complex ceremonial bloodletting rituals and the terrifying encounters between the human ruler and the powerful supernatural beings of the Olmec cosmos. Take, for instance, La Venta Stela 3. It dramatically depicts a figure of immense authority, draped in the most elaborate finery, seemingly emerging from the gaping maw of a mythical cave creature, the literal portal to the underworld. The energy required to sustain this staggering level of ritual complexity and massive engineering projects was fueled by an equally incredible economic machine. The Olmec trade network was the central nervous system of early Mesoamerica, linking distant communities through the exchange of high-status goods and, even more importantly, the circulation of powerful ideas and technology. Olmec-style pottery, polished magnetite mirrors, and, most crucially, their unique ideological system traveled hundreds of miles north and south, marking their cultural influence as indelible. Their obsession with jade was legendary. It wasn't just beautiful, but metaphysically potent, symbolizing water, fertility, and the life-giving flow of the cosmos, making it the supreme status symbol. To control this symbol, the Olmec sourced high-quality jade hundreds of kilometers away in the challenging terrain of the Motagua River Valley of Guatemala, a feat of logistics and political dominance that spanned regions far outside their immediate Gulf Coast homeland. This absolute command over high-status exotic materials solidified their position at the undisputed apex of the regional hierarchy, untouchable and utterly dominant. But their legacy was not just material, it was intellectual. While the Maya later perfected and amplified it, the Olmec are the undisputed originators of the core Mesoamerican intellectual toolkit. The very concepts underlying the complex long-count calendar, the essential 260-day ritual calendar, Tzolk'in, and the fundamental idea of recording time in permanent stone likely began here, within the Olmec heartland. Although still debated, evidence like the Cascacao block points towards an incredibly early, sophisticated form of writing, a protoscript that held the profound seeds of the glyphic systems that would define the region millennia later. They were the engine, the inventors, the spiritual overlords. They had the engineering, the art, the astronomical knowledge, and the economic muscle to last forever. And yet, the end came with a terrifying, inexplicable abruptness that still defies conventional explanation. Around 400 BCE, the great centers like La Venta and Tres Zapotes stopped functioning. It was not a slow, gentle decline. It was a cultural switch, flipped suddenly to the off position. Did internal strife, perhaps a violent rebellion against the heavy-handed elite control symbolized by those useless buried offerings, finally shatter the system? Did localized environmental catastrophe, maybe a catastrophic shift in the river courses they depended on so heavily, starve the heartland, leading to mass abandonment? Or was it something far more insidious? A spiritual sickness or an exhaustion of faith
that led the populace to ritually dismantle their own civilization, walking away from the colossal burdens of the mother culture. The silence that descended upon the Olmec lands was not empty. It was filled by the scrambling, desperate echoes of dozens of smaller cultures trying to inherit the throne, desperately avoiding the same lethal mistake their progenitors had made.